Hello, I'm Pàdraig Murphy, and I'm the producer here on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay at Cubicle 7 Games. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a role-playing game set in the grim and perilous old world. The game itself has been around since the 1980s, and we're currently involved in its 4th edition. It's extremely popular and enjoyed by people the world over. What differentiates it a little bit from some other role-playing games you might have enjoyed is its particularly brutal and unforgiving setting. Here, you don't begin life as great heroes ready to go out and prove your destiny, but as rat catchers, beggars, and unwary nobles thrust into adventures that you're clearly not prepared for, and you'll be very lucky to survive. Part of what makes it so intriguing and challenging and rewarding is when you do manage to snap some modicum of victory and adventure from a very unfair world, which is almost certainly out to kill you at every possible opportunity. It's one of my favourite role-playing games, and I think that it could be yours as well. But first, let's talk a little bit about the setting. The setting is one of the most appealing parts of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The old world itself has been explored in dozens of books, games, tabletop battle games, role-playing games, computer games over the years, and its rich history and background appeals to people the world over, and for good reason. Most of your adventures will take place in the Empire. It's probably the single most powerful country in the world. Mostly occupied by humans, though with some halflings, elves, and of course the dwarves, who have had an alliance with humans stretching back to the very foundations of the Empire 2,500 years ago. To the west, you have the Wasteland, so named because it was deemed worthless and given away long ago to local minor lords. But the city of Marienburg has grown into a powerful merchant presence there. To the west is Bretonnia, another human-dominated empire where mighty knights cross the land, many of them in service to the Lady of the Lake, a deity they revere but perhaps barely understand. Also to the west and further to the south is Athel Loren. It is woods ruled by the strange and unearthly wood elves. Their kind find it difficult to relate to humans, and indeed humans find it particularly difficult to relate to them. It is a brave band indeed that wanders inside that forest, and very few ever come out alive again. To the south you have the Border Princes, wild lands ruled by warlords, tyrants and worse. But further to the west of that you have Tilia, and further on Estalia, other human countries, human-dominated countries, that further from the chaos wastes than the Empire could perhaps be seen as somewhat soft by your average imperial citizen. To the north you have Kislev, another human-dominated country, but beyond that things start to get a little bit more dicey. There's Troll country, occupied by terrible monsters, trolls, ogres and worse, and beyond that Norska, and further still the northern wastes. Far, far beyond that, rumours of a portal by which the forces of chaos enter the world. Indeed, frequently in the Empire's 2,500-year history, forces have poured forth from the north and laid waste to much of the Empire. It's been riven with internal strife, it's fallen apart, been put back together, and indeed, inside the Empire there's still forces always chipping away at it. Chaos sometimes comes in the form of large armies of terrible beasts and corrupted beings, but other times it's a more insidious threat that chips away from the inside. Your adventurers will have the opportunity to confront chaos, and if they're lucky, escape it, as well as confront the other forces that dominate the world. Not all of them inherently evil, but all of them diametrically opposed to you getting ahead in the world. The Empire itself is 2,500 years old. It was founded by Sigmar, who was once a man, a tribal chieftain, but ascended to godhood, and indeed is revered as a god throughout the Empire. There are other religions which are of equal or even greater importance in some places. Middenheim, for example, reveres the god of winter, wolves and warfare, Ulrich. And indeed there are other minor cults. The Empire is a polytheistic setting, and somewhere that everyone can find a deity that appeals to them personally, and most people are sensible enough to hedge their bets and make offerings to more than one. If you're interested in playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there are two main ways to get into the game. If you're an experienced role player, you can probably go right ahead and buy the core rulebook. The core rulebook contains everything you need to know how to play. It's got a character creation, setting information. It's got all of the rules you need to run an excellent game, as well as various player aids, equipment, everything else you need to play. It's the only book, if you could only get one book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, that is the book to pick up. Alternatively, and even if you are experienced, but particularly if you're not totally comfortable with role-playing games, we recommend picking up the starter set. The starter set takes place in the city of Ubersreich, which is one of the main merchant cities in the Reichland province of the Empire. Ubersreich, the setting, is built out in depth inside the starter kit. A host of adventures are laid out, ready for a party to dive in, and indeed 6 pre-generated characters are included. So in the starter set, you have everything you need to dive in straight away. There's a cut down version of the rules, which lays out all of the most important concepts in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. There's various reference cards, a nice selection of tokens to help you keep track of important game concepts, and various cheat sheets to let you get through combats, tests, and all of the other things you need to do to play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as easily as possible. It's an excellent way for new players to pick up the game, and even if you are experienced, the setting information is very, very good, and it leads nicely into Ubersreich Adventures, which are a series of adventures that we've made available both online and as a printed product, that let you expand the story of Ubersreich and the story of your adventures and their experiences in the city and beyond. Let's take a moment to talk about some of the core concepts of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So, first, let's take a look at one of the pre-generated characters from the starter set. This is Gunnar Rolfsson. Gunnar is a dwarf, and specifically he's a slayer. Slayers are dwarves who, through some personal tragedy, some great shame, or some other betrayal or terrible act, have been forced to swear the Slayer's Oath. Gunnar has given up all of the life he knew. Everyone he may have ever known would disavow him, and now he simply seeks an honourable death in combat. So Gunnar naturally would like to take up the life of an adventurer, and it's perhaps one of the more natural fits you'll find for it in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But let's take a look at what we need to play. There's only 2 dice that you'll ever need. Together these are called a D100. One of them shows the tens and the other shows the units. When you roll the 2 together, you simply read off the number. I've got a 10 on my tens dice, or a 1 I should say, and a 5 on my units dice. So that means that's a 15. I'm always trying to roll low in WFRP. And in most cases I simply want to roll below the number printed on my character sheet for a specific action. So for example, Gunnar is quite good in a fight. His weapon skill is 45. So when I roll, if I get 45 or less, in this case a 31, I've probably succeeded at what I'm trying to do. Sometimes I'll be opposed by someone else, and the degree by which I've succeeded will become important. These are called success levels, and you work them out by taking the tens number, in this case a 3, and subtracting that from the number printed on your character sheet. So that's a 45, so 3 from 4 leaves me with 1 success level. That's probably a hit, but if my opponent defended very well, I may have missed. Simpler tests just want to know if you succeeded or not. For example, on a consume alcohol test, something else Gunnar is very skilled at, Gunnar has a 63 in consume alcohol. I simply roll, and finding a 15, I've succeeded very, very well by at least 5 success levels, which means that Gunnar is not really feeling this particular drink and probably go for a few more. Very unfitting for a dwarf. As we just discussed, Gunnar is fond of a drink. He probably drinks a little bit too much at times, and even when he's sober, he can still be something of a grating individual. Late one night, after enjoying a few kegs of weak human ale, but nevertheless, quantity has a quality all of its own, Gunnar insults the wrong noble. Stumbling out of the bar late that night, singing an ode to the tragic fall of Carrick Eight Peaks, Gunnar is confronted by the noble in the street, who pulls forth his rapier and without a word dives for the dwarf. In all likelihood, the last mistake that man will ever make. The first thing we'll want to look at is Gunnar's initiative stat. It's 34. You compare that to everybody else's initiative and that decides who goes first. We do include an option rule for randomizing this, but we don't suggest you use it when you're starting out. Let's say the noble has an initiative of 30. Gunnar's a little bit faster than him. Despite the noble making the first move, Gunnar isn't surprised. He is always expecting a fight. The blade strikes towards his heart. So Gunnar is going to strike first, and all we need to do here is roll against Gunnar's weapon skill. Now, if you're playing later on, you'll see that there are melee skills for specific weapons. That's not covered in the starter set, but that lets you add an extra depth to your character's customization. Someone might be extremely skilled, for example, in two-handed weapons, but not be so great with a rapier. Gunnar is very good with his axe, however. He strikes out. He rolls a 12. That's an excellent roll. Taking the 1 on the 10s dice away from the 4 in the 10s of Gunnar's weapon skill, we see that's a success by 3. The noble's surprised, but still has trained in the foil and he might well parry. 49. He does not parry. He's less skilled than Gunnar, and even with the bonus SL from his defensive weapon, that's still not enough to stop the dwarf's attack. Gunnar passes by 1 success level against the noble, which means it's a hit. So we add that to Gunnar's damage. Gunnar's damage comes from his strength bonus and his weapon. So taking a look at his axe, we see that the damage is +4. This has all been worked out for you in advance. So we add the 4 from his axe to the 3 from his strength for 7, and then the 1 from the extra SL that wasn't needed to hit the noble. So any extra SL that you didn't need gets added to damage for 8 damage altogether. Now the noble takes his toughness bonus away from that, and he would take any armor away from it as well, but probably out for a night out. He isn't wearing his leathers or anything like that, so he's cut and loses wounds. In this case, we did 8 damage. We'll take away the noble's toughness bonus of 3, meaning that was 5 damage. Let's see where he hit. You'd normally do this first in case there was any armor to take account of. For example, armor on your chest doesn't protect you if you're hitting your leg. That's a 77, which on the hit points chart printed on the character sheet we can see is a hit to the body. Gunnar embeds his axe in the noble's chest. 5 wounds is probably quite a lot to lose. Gunnar has quite a lot of wounds, 18 because he's a dwarf, but your average human probably only has between 10 and 12. That's a serious injury, and this noble is probably immediately thinking twice about what he's just gotten himself into. If he's with a bunch of friends, he may pull back and the friends will dive in, much to Gunnar's delight. But as he came on his own tonight, he almost certainly drops his foil where it stands and runs into the street, white as a sheet, both from fear and from blood loss. Gunnar probably heads home, or perhaps back to the bar for a nightcap after such an exhilarating diversion. So, if you've already picked up our starter set or core rulebook and you're plunging deep into the mired and dangerous streets of Ubersreich and enjoying your adventures across the Empire and the old world at large, you may find yourself wondering what other Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay products are available and where can I get them? So let's help you out with that. The first one that you might be interested in is a web exclusive, and it's our all rolled up dice trays. Now, these are really cool. They come nicely packed up like this, and you can pack them back up like that when you need to bring them from place to place. And via a very clever system of buttons, they turn into a really nice dice tray. Now these are available in 3 styles. They keep your dice under control and not running all over the table, which is great. And I also like them for when you're playing online and you want to roll physical dice. These don't clatter quite so loudly, so you're not going to annoy all your fellow players by rolling huge loud dice on echoey wooden tables. So I really like these. There's 3 really nice pieces of art on them, and I think they're a great present for yourself or for somebody else. They're really nice. So the GM screen consists of 2 components, which you get both in the bundle when you order it. And the first is the Game Master screen document, which contains advice on how to run Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's very useful for new GMs, but there's also lots of concepts, rules and charts in here that will be super helpful to veterans as well. So it contains advice on what makes Warhammer, how to run a game, the main themes and ideas that run throughout stories in the old world. And of course, this is just advice, but will help you run a game that's very authentically Warhammer and really suits the old world. And I think that it can help make games more fun to run and more fun to play. It also touches on some of the more intricate rules of the setting. So you've got some ideas on how to deal with advantage, because sometimes players that are very canny can run away from you if you aren't careful about taking their advantage away from them. which is an important combat consideration. Along with that, you'll find some interesting advice on making some NPCs. Just one of my favorites are in here, which is an excellent cheesemonger that I definitely think you should try his cheese if you get the chance. And we also have the charts at the back. Now these are very, very handy for quickly coming up with adventures on the fly. So we've got a kind of we're hanging out in a pub chart, which lets you know, like a quick adventure you could find if you're struck for a job where you might make a few coin nice and quickly. It also contains a chart to explain how characters might know each other, which is useful for NPCs or for PCs starting out. I know not everybody loves running large session zeros where you figure out how everybody knows each other. So it can be good just roll a dice and say, well, I know you because I used to date your sister, and you know me because you killed my landlord one time and I helped you hide the body. So there's interesting stuff in there. And my favorite chart of all is definitely the chart of doomings. So in the Empire, when you're 10 years old, that's the age of majority, when you're just about an adult, a doomsayer will come around and give you your dooming, which is a cryptic phrase explaining how you will die. And that will hang over you for the rest of your life. And I think that probably helps set the tone for the lives of people who, the lives of citizens of the Empire. And also it intersects nicely with some game mechanics, which is if your character dies in a way that suits their dooming, they get to retain a chunk of their XP, or rather the player does, for their next character. So I really love this document. I think it's great. And as I said, for new GMs or for experienced veterans, just pick this up. It will help you create just more flavorful, interesting games and make the burden of running games a little bit easier. Along with that, you also get this very cool thing, which is our GM screen. It's printed on a 3mm very heavy backed material, which contains some really lovely art printed on one side by our own Sam Manley, which came out very, very well. And it shows the streets of Ubersreich, many of its very characterful individuals, and it's really, really nice for your players to be looking at while you hide your notes and dice behind it. And of course, on the other side, you'll find a whole host of charts and reference sheets full of really useful information, and some of the most looked up things that you will need are on here. Common conditions, you've got a quick reminder on how opposed tests and success level works, how advantage is gained and lost, most of the most common weapons, ranged and melee, as well as shields and armor types, quick rules on just lots of things that you might need. There's also this very handy chart of names, common names of halflings, dwarves, elves and humans in the Reichland, which is very, very handy, because I know that I as a GM often struggle to pull an appropriate name off the top of my head, along with some character traits, motivations and quirk tables, which are very, very useful for quickly generating an NPC or to help out your players if they're having trouble coming up with a concept. So I really think this is a great addition for any GM. It's sturdy, it's strong, and it's a really, really nice tool. So I think you'll be running games with this for a long time to come if you pick it up. It's really great.